Assalamualaikum everyone, I hope you're well, and we have to start because we're a little late. We are pursuing on the same endeavor on the Bandung+60 and the Global South, and we have the chance of having 4 presentations. So I'm delighted to share this. We're probably going to reduce for 5 minutes to allow more interaction. Presentation is not fair. I just finished presenting, so I can now play another role. So if you can exceed for 3-4 minutes would be good, but if you can be in 15 minutes. We will start from one of our hosts, because he works nearby. I hope we can go and visit his museum. He's an educator, Mr. Desmond Satria Andrian, and he's going to speak on the new Asian-African Strategic Partnership in search of the emancipative instrument for the South. So, Mr. Satria Andrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my presentation on NAASP. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Mr. Darwis who have already given this opportunity for me to present the idea of in search of emancipative instrument of the new Asian-African Strategic Partnership. I'm Desmond. I'm an educator. I work in Museum of the Asian-African Conference. I promise I will make this presentation very effective. Well, the title I refer to have for this presentation is New Asian-African Strategic Partnership in search of the emancipatory instrument for the South. And next, please. Here is the presentation outline I would like to offer you this afternoon. First, this is Asia-Africa in 4 international systems. 2, anarchy and hegemony, a paradox of peace value. The third, Rezasyah Bandung during and post-Cold War. And the fourth, this is New Asian-African Strategic Partnership, a transition from liberalism to liberalism institutional. Next, please. Well, here is my research question for my presentation is, how does the constructivism explain the positioning of the New Asian-African Strategic Partnership as the emancipatory instrument for the South? I'm interested in having this research question because in another way we discuss about how to revitalize the Bandung spirit, and we see now we are living in the omnipolarism system, and we have already a mechanism to work, to have a cooperation interregional Asia-Africa, and we have already done that in 2005. This is the New Asian-African Strategic Partnership, and so that's why I'm interested in discussing this. My hypothesis is New Asian-African Strategy and AASP is yet in the making process as the emancipatory instrument for the South. So the age is only 10 years after it was signed in this building in 2005 as a part of the result of the Asian-African Summit 2005. And we will see how the fact examined during 10 years after it was signed in 2005. Next, please. And I would like to operationalize my hypothesis. I would like to bring the fact I have already observed into epistemological phase. I use neorealism. I use it to explain the reality where the NAASP should function per se. And then the liberalism institutional, it is to propose a new proposition where the NAASP should lead to. Please, next. Here is, we have to observe the dynamic of international system since the idea of Bandung Conference was designed 60 years ago in Indonesia, and then continued to Colombo Plan, and then finally being executed in Bandung. At least I saw 4 international systems that influence greatly the international situation. The first one, this is the Silk Road International System. The Silk Road International System is a bridging channel to bridge the cultural inter-exchange between Asia and Africa. And remember, during this international system, the state-nation Westphalian model did not exist yet. So we can say that the concept of interaction between the countries during the Silk Road International System is what's so-called as the family of nation. And the family of nation is the basic concept of Dasasila Bandung, which is referring to the social nationalism of Pancasila of Indonesia, and in another way, this is popularly known as the Marhainism. And after Silk Road, it is continued by the New World Expedition. And the New World Expedition, it ended to the new period of international system. This is the Mercantilism International System. The Mercantilism International System, it was not based on the values of family nation, but it was based on the materialism. The beginning concept of Westphalian Agreement model just began to be implemented in several countries in the north, and then it was implemented also in the Asia, Africa, Latin America, and what's so-called as the colonialism. And this period is continued by the Cold War in 1947, what's so-called as bipolarism, and it is also based on the materialism, and it happened almost between 1947 to the 1990s. And in the last but not least, between 1990s to 1998, we are facing once upon a time the period of unipolarism system. And now, after 1998, we are facing the omnipolarism system, where we do not know who is the real hegemony against the global south today. So this is the real international system that we should observe before discussing where the NASB should go after 2015. Next, please. I would like to say that the anarchy and hegemony, a paradox of peace value. International system is always anarchy. It doesn't have a structure. If we believe that state-nation actor as the only superstructure in the structure of international system, and the anarchy is based on values, not material, because values prevent the hegemony and material provokes the hegemony. Next, please. I would like to invite us to see the Dasasila Bandung during and the post-Cold War. Here is a quotation I took from the 4th paragraph of preamble of the Indonesian Constitution 1945 to participate in the world order based on the freedom, abiding peace, and social justice. This is a mandate from Indonesian Constitution to organize the Bandung Conference. And if you are wondering why the Bandung Conference was held in Bandung, this idea was born in Bandung in March 1933. This is called as the social nationalism, the synthesis between nationalism and internationalism, which was written by Sukarno in Bandung in March 1933. He said in his speech in March 1933, someday if Indonesian Bandeng is kind of a big buffalo, someday if Indonesian Bandeng has been working together with the tiger of the Philippines, with the hyena snake of Vietnam, peacock of Burma, white elephant of Thailand, Chinese dragon baronsai, Nendigo of Burma, Nendigo of India, and Sphinx of Egypt, and all East African freedom fighters, and the international colonialism must be smashed into bits. This is the root of ideology to fight against the international colonialism. This was born in Bandung in March 1933. It was formulated in the ideology of Marhainism. And freedom, it is achieved by the organization of the Bandung Conference. Abiding peace, it is achieved by the establishment of the non-aligned movement, and the social justice, it is in the process we have been doing the South-South cooperation, now the South-South and triangular cooperation, and yet the NAASP. Next, please. Rezasyah Bandung during and the post-Cold War for the continued ones, I would like to say that Rezasyah Bandung vis-a-vis realism of Cold War. During the Cold War, during the bipolarism system, values in the opposite of materialism, yes. It is impossible for the countries in the third world countries, in the developing countries, to have a balance of power by increasing the military equipment. In the meanwhile, they just got independence. How to achieve the balance of power? How to achieve the balance of power to give a deterrence effect to defend the national interest. In the meanwhile, these newly independent countries are still fighting for the acknowledgement of the independence and the dignity. Values as the universalism of humanity against the rationalism of realism. And post-Cold War, we have Nawasila Bandung. This is 9 principles of Bandung. It was declared in this building in 2005, a part of the NAASP. Nawasila Bandung vis-a-vis liberalism of post-Cold War. Today, this is not the era of realism. This is the era of global governance explained by liberalism, values in conjunction of liberalism. And values could be the instrument required a process of embodiment of the NASP. Next, please. This is the peak of my presentation, and ASP from liberalism to neoliberalism institutional. We know that the NAASP has 3 pillars: B2B, business to business. It can be explained, liberalism interdependency. It's quite impossible today that we see the interdependency happen everywhere as the impact, the rationalism impact of the globalization. And then B2B, this is what we have already discussed before, how to share the ideas among peoples, youth. This museum has already done this since 2009 by making a participatory public through the establishment of France of Museum of the Asian African Conference. And then G2G, now the level of cooperation amongst G2G, among government to government, is still on the level of liberalism. This is my idea, this is my hypothesis, that we need to transform the liberalism of G2G to liberalism institutional. Why? Because regionalism based on liberalism institutional, we have already seen that clearly in Africa, taking one example, the Organization of African Union transformed to the African Union. Now it has its own non-indifference principle. And this is a new beginning era of the African Union. ASEAN Way. And what we understand about the ASEAN Way is not a part of the neoliberalism institutional. At the beginning of the discussion of the NAASP, we saw the participation in many sub-regional organization conference, what we call ASRO. Why don't we try to unite them, the AASROC, Asian African Sub-Regional Organization Conference, into liberalism institutional? Simply, we need embodiment of NAASP to guide, to accompany, to escort the mechanism of cooperation within among Asian African countries. Next, please. This is my conclusion. And AASP should be enhanced its function by establishing a permanent secretariat. And then values is the only way to keep the peace sustainable. Transformation of liberalism of Rezasyah Bandung to Nawasila. It means the transformation liberalism institutional of NASP as the emancipatory instrument. We hope that this can come true. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Desmond Adrian. I think for those of you who are not familiar with the concept and epistemology of policy and realistic analysis, it could be a little different, and if you have some constructivist approach knowledge, the attempt to understand, I guess you should maybe elaborate a little on Rezasyah and Nawasila for those of you and us who are not familiar. Truly, I have a lot of questions on the background of the liberal institutional, because we have learned all this from the World Bank policy and it failed. I try to understand how it fits with the agenda, but I can't wait to have more people commenting or interested in the paper. And now we're going to go to another researcher, Mr. Fahmi Mohammed Ramzan from Malaysia. And he's working on a very interesting topic. You probably know since Bernard Kouchner and Mario Petati in the United Nations system, we have major transformation, right of interference in the humanitarian world. This expand international relations, change absolutely the way we understand human rights. And Mr. Ramzan will analyze humanitarian intervention, rethinking its implementation towards sovereignty and global justice. Mr. Ramzan, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil muslimin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Darwis, speakers, and all participants. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and good evening. Inshallah, I will present the little bit tough topic about analysis of humanitarian intervention, rethinking its implementation towards sovereignty and global justice. Since the time is very limited, I will make the presentation as simple as possible. Okay, my name is Muhammad Fahmi Ramzan. I am from the Department of Islamic Political Science, University of Malaysia. Okay, we go to introduction. Okay, I think maybe some of participants not about the humanitarian intervention today. So I will give the simple meaning of humanitarian intervention. Since the post-Cold War, the world was introduced by one of the terms in the international politics that called humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention is one of the most controversial concepts in global politics, and as such, it is directly the opposite of the rule of non-intervention, which was dominant in global politics since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Okay, Treaty of Westphalia is the treaty that ended 30 years war in Europe since 1618 until 1648. Okay, the concept of humanitarian intervention has gained a measure of international sanction, not least from all world leaders as expressed in important United Nations document, but it remains controversial in practice. There are no agreed standards as to what constitutes a violation of human rights sufficiently grave to trigger an intervention. While there is a measure of agreement that the UN Security Council is the body capable of authorizing interventions, there are difficulties as to what happens when consensus cannot be reached, as is so often the case, particularly when matters as serious as an intervention into the internal affairs of a sovereign state are on the table. So it's the controversial concept nowadays, because humanitarian intervention most probably occurred in 1990s until today. Okay, definition, we go to definition. Commonly understood, it stands for the use of external military force against a sovereign state to stop its government from mistreating its own citizens. It also implies the use of force to halt violation of human rights by a determined entity against a minority or another ethnic group. So I think we can understand the meaning of humanitarian intervention. Okay, in general, I conclude many scholars, many definitions from the political science scholars, and I make it into one definition. It may be defined as possible action by state to prevent or to end gross violation of human rights on behalf of people other than their own nationals through the use of armed force without the consent of the target government and with or without UN authorization. Okay, some common points I made principle about the definition of human intervention. Okay, firstly, use of military force. The military intervention of the West occurred when another international organization or another state entered another state that have a crisis and used by the military force. Okay, secondly, the absence of the target state's permission. Thirdly, its aim is to help non-national, not just national, not just the citizen by Russia or by Bosnia, but it helps non-national also. And agency of intervention. Some confine the term of intervention by states on their own. There is a recent tendency to include intervention under UN umbrella. Okay, we go to the legal aspect, the law of the international humanitarian. Okay, the first matter that comes to mind about the legality of humanitarian intervention is that this doctrine contrasts the rules from UN Charter that prohibits intervention. We can refer the UN Charter, thing number 2 in bracket 4. And the actual international order based on the sovereignty of states which date back to 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. Furthermore, in the Nuremberg process, aggression was recognized as the main crime, as the main crime, because all other crimes were seen as motivated by it. On the other hand, the same charter provided an important space for human rights protection. Human rights were put in the center of world politics for the first time in the Charter and mentioned them 7 times. While the Charter gives authority to the Security Council to approve the use of force in order to secure international peace and security, it does not provide the same authority in order to protect human rights, unless we follow that human rights violation is a direct threat to peace. So, this have a contradiction about the two UN Charter. First, UN Charter, and secondly, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, UN Charter Article 2. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. But in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, have a contradiction. No one shall be subject to total or to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. So have a contradiction about the article. Okay, we look at Noam Chomsky, left-oriented intellectual in US. He said, Charter forbids use of force against state sovereignty. Universal Declaration guarantees right of individuals against oppressed states. The question of humanitarian intervention is based on the contradiction. Okay. The responsibility to protect. So, when the concept of humanitarian intervention have a controversial, one international commission was built in Canada. The right of humanitarian intervention was developed in the report Responsibility to Protect, which was adopted by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty in 2001. After long negotiation, and was established by the Canadian government. According to the article, states have a duty to intervene in order to provide safety to citizens or other states that abuse their rights. The article is also clear about what authority should ensure protection. The UN Security Council, in order to make decision-making easier, it was recommended to the permanent members of Security Council not to use veto when their vital interests are not in danger and not to disturb the adoption of declaration, which already have major support in Article 3. With the responsibility to protect state sovereignty became not just a privilege, but also a responsibility. Okay. The intervention that allowed, we refer to J.G. Starr, the one of scholars in Islamic in political science. Okay, firstly, collective intervention prescribed in the UN Charter. Number 2, to protect the rights and interests of citizens and the security of the state Number 3, self-defense. If intervention is needed immediately after an armed attack, term of self-defense is instant, overwhelming situation, leaving no means, no moment of deliberation. Number 4, if the state would intervene proceeded to have committed a gross violation of international law. Number 5, must get permission or not in violation of the provisions of the United Nations Charter. Okay, we look relatively the tip of my presentation. Okay, we look the reality today. Humanitarian intervention was one of the dominant issues since 1990s. It was a decade during which humanitarian issues played a historical unprecedented role in international politics. Today, the idea of humanitarian intervention has become one of the international agenda. But throughout the history of the case, humanitarian intervention conducted by a party or a country against other countries often lead to controversy. The implementation seems biased and have political agenda by superpowers. The hegemony of superpowers gives negative impact to some countries and the world community. The international organization and superpowers make a selective intervention. They do not intervene in the name of human rights with the major humanitarian issues today that involving Muslim people. If we look at the 3 biggest issues today in politics around the world, I think many big issues, but I'm trying to show these 3 issues. Number one is Israel-Palestine conflict, which until today continues. I think the UN, United Nations as the center of international organization, must do the strong role to solve this conflict. Number 2, Syrian conflict. Nowadays, about the government of Syria and the rebel. Also, we can say conflict about the Sunni and Shia. Okay. Number 3 is Rohingya conflict, which is, we know Rohingya is the most persecuted minority in the world, says the UNHCR. It is very pity of them. Okay, we discussed about the rethinking about the implementation. Okay, I'm from Islamic point of view. What exactly humanitarian intervention is? The rise of the concept of statehood went hand in hand with recognition of the international personality of states, which was consolidated by the principle of equal sovereignty among all members of the international community. This is an acceptable principle from the Islamic point of view. For its purpose is to enable every state to live in freedom, security and peace, and be dedicated to fulfilling its obligation towards its people. It is also prohibited to interfere in other nations' affairs or attempt to weaken the structure of another state, as Muslims have no right to act in this manner. Consequently, this is a recognition or acknowledgement of the existence of other nations and a prohibition of any attempts to eradicate them or the standards they have set for their guidance. A group of Muslim legal scholars decided that the reason for coming in Islam is to fight those who are outside the law or fan of aggression, and not atheism or religious difference. The evidence is that the killing of civilians or non-combatant is prohibited, and in my covenant agreements are concluded with non-Muslims who live in the abode of Islam in peace and without complaints. Furthermore, Islam encourages new venues for interaction and trade with other nations in order to establish good relations between Muslims and others. So humanitarian intervention could be implemented as long as it is fair and just aims to prevent the ongoing genocide by a government or group. It will always be a controversy when its implementation is in the political interest and not in its entirety. It also not just use of force, also can be implemented firstly by the method of diplomacy and economic sanctions. The implementation must look to the cause of conflict, because reality today, The main cause of conflicts came from the parties that have the power and authority. We not just against terrorism, but we also must against the real terrorists. Okay, that's all from me. Okay, role of Asian African before I stop. Unite as one community to help others. Example, military aid and financial assistance. Number 2, expand the humanitarian issues that occur today. And number 3, strengthening economic and stabilize political environment. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Mohanty. I think this topic is very delicate. It's a new component of international law. The law is not yet clear, obviously. As he mentioned accurately, this is in opposition to the rule of non-intervention. Against a state minority, crime against humanity, genocide, if it's proven, it could be certainly something that international law should defend, even if you expand it. But he raised also the responsibility to protect as also reflecting the political agenda of the hegemonic powers. And many examples, whether it's Mali or Libya, or the example he raised, Israel, Palestine, or the condition of Rohingya people. Quite interesting, we didn't really have much time to elaborate on the Islamic point of view, the position of the Sharia on this, and probably in the debate we will have a chance. So thank you very much, Monsieur Adrian. And now let us, probably also you will have a chance to come back to your points, but before we get to that, we'll have also another researcher at Teuku University, Mr. Tulus Tambunan from Indonesia. So welcome. He also is going to elaborate on these topics on two big economic crises. He's questioning whether the Indonesian experience and lessons learned from other Asian African developing countries. Thank you, Mr. Tambunan.
Okay, thank you very much. I come to you with a rather different topic. If not 180 degrees different, but maybe more than 100 degrees different. But still important for us because all countries in the world are vulnerable to any crisis that can happen anytime, especially since 2008. So I will discuss two big crises that Indonesia ever experienced since the independence, 1945. And maybe some lesson can be learned for other countries, not only Africa but also Asian countries. Although I never heard any African countries experience similar crisis as many Asian crises ever had, like the Asian financial crisis in 1998. So Indonesia had experienced two crises, and initially the crisis came from outside with different initial causes or driven factors, and also with different ends or different impacts. And the two crises are Asian financial crisis, 1997, and followed by global financial crisis, 2008. Next. So if we look at the first crisis, the initial cause of the crisis was sudden capital outflow from Indonesia. And it was triggered first by the depreciation of Thai baht, the neighbor country. And in that time, the depreciation of Thai baht made investors, especially foreign investors in Indonesia, worry that the same can happen in Indonesia with rupiah. So they suddenly flew out of Indonesia with their money, and indeed rupiah depreciated because of rumor or worry, and then maybe overact, and that indeed rupiah depreciated. And while the initial cause of 2008 crisis came from the US with financial crisis, a mortgage crisis, and it became world income crisis and world demand decline. And because Indonesia, until now, heavily depends on not only on export of primary goods, but also on a number of manufactured goods to US. So in Europe, especially Germany, France, and Holland and UK to a certain extent. So the drop of world income, especially from Europe, and because also Europe triggered also by United crisis or Greece crisis, and world demand declined originally from US and also from Japan, and it became negative for Indonesian export, and Indonesian export declined, and so on and so on. Next, I tried to explain, but you have also in the paper, if you could not see very clearly, I tried to explain how just a simple depreciation of a currency of rupiah became the biggest crisis Indonesia ever had since 1945, even until now. So you can see the channels. We start with the depreciation of rupiah, and then we hope theoretically export will increase, but it was not to happen. Why export didn't increase? Because the component of that export imported. So the exporter could not gain from the depreciation of their money, rupiah. So the export increase didn't happen. So production increase didn't happen. Import on the other side declined, and if the import of components, it means production domestically also declined, and then employment declined, and so on and so on and so on, and also banking crisis, and then end with political crisis, and Suharto stepped down in 1998 with the triggered by the killing of 4 students from Trisakti University, and all students from Jakarta demonstrate, and then Suharto say, I will step down. So in that time we were happy. Trisakti was the key player in this reform. And next, the second, here I also tried to explain how the 2008-2009 crisis originally from US originally was mortgage crisis, and it became worldwide crisis because world demand declined, and then it became negative for Indonesia. Okay, next. Here you can see the impact of the 1998 crisis. You can see during Suharto time, we had a very wonderful time, golden age during Suharto, because we had on average growth rate of GDP around 9%, especially in 1980s and in the first of 1990s before the crisis. But suddenly in 1998, the crisis hit Indonesia, and then we jumped down until minus 90.9% negative growth for the first time we ever had since 1945, even since the colonialization time. So it was very big hit for Indonesia because we never prepared for that. Because the World Bank always say Indonesia is the new coming Asian tiger with Malaysia and Thailand in that time. And the existing tiger was already Taipei, Taiwan, and South Korea. Japan not included, but one is the biggest tiger in that time. But then we became not, unfortunately, because of the crisis, we did not become new Asian tiger, but maybe new Asian cat, small cat. Unfortunately. Next. And you see income per capita during Suharto increased. Many rich people in 1980s, but suddenly in 1998 dropped. If we start in 1970, we was the same as in Nepal and Sri Lanka, around $100 per capita. But because of Suharto, we increased very fast. But because of the crisis, we jumped again into around $600 per capita. And if you look at the poverty rate as figure, then you can see that during Suharto, the poverty rate based on rupiah, current poverty line, steadily declined, but during the crisis, up a little bit under 24.2%. And now we come to the second crisis, some data. You can see here the first quarter of 2008 and 2009, and the last quarter of 2008, and the first 2009 per quarter. You can see here Indonesia was much better compared to Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, especially Singapore, because Singapore until now is very 100% open economy, because small countries, so they must open. They don't have anything, so they must open to the world. So Singapore is the most vulnerable country for any crisis that will happen in the world. And so Indonesia was much better in 2008. Next figure, here you can see also our growth rate decline, but still positive. If you compare to 1998, minus 13%, but here it's only down a little bit. So we was very good in that time compared to the first crisis. Next table. Here we can see Indonesia, for instance, in the growth rate around in 2009 around 4.5%, much better than Thailand and some European countries, although a little bit lower than in India and so on. China, of course, since 1990s already good in the performance, around 8.4% in 2009. And this figure also shows that during the crisis, many, this moment, because of the crisis, before it also took a long time, so different time. Number of laid-off and home workers in the formal sector also, you can see here as the evidence of the impact of the crisis. And next figure. And open unemployment also you can see here during the crisis. But it's very interesting. Why in February 2009, in the time that the crisis was still there, but the open unemployment, or even 2008, the open unemployment declined. The only answer is that because, like in many African, Asian countries, we have so-called informal sector. Informal sector or informal employment, they help much. Many people like fired from formal sector, from company hit by the crisis, they can find job in informal sector. While data on unemployment, official open unemployment also including in informal sector. So if we say the employment in Indonesia, let's say 20% increase, it means also in the informal sector. So that's why lucky that we have informal sector that help many people not to become poor even during the crisis. I think also in India and many other countries, informal sector is very crucial. And next video. Here, poverty rate, next slide. Here you can see also decline continues even during the crisis. Mainly also because of, first, we have very big informal sector. If you go outside here, you can see many informal employment or activities means based on ILO, informal means activities not registered, not paying tax and so on, not official. So, what are the main factors that made the two crises different? Next, here. First, Indonesian economy performed well after the first crisis. That's why we prepared a lot for the next crisis. That's the first point. The second point is very important for other countries. The banking sector must keep sound. The banking sector must keep sound. And we done that after the first crisis. The third, very also important until now, consumer prices kept stable. It's very important. Inflation must not beyond 2 digits, must below 1 digit. That's okay. That's the third factor. Next, external position must remain sound, especially dealing with debt, foreign debt. Must not, the ratio to GDP must not too big, not beyond 50%. So obligation must, you have to meet your obligation anytime, and that was not before 98, but that has been improved until after 98. And second, Indonesian public finance are strong after the crisis, and also especially next point is because of the crisis in 1998, that cautious policies by the government become more evident than before. And also other reason that maybe because Indonesia until now is still rather close economy compared to Singapore. That's why during 2008, when the world income declined, was not very big to Indonesia and compared to Singapore. Because Singapore, we deal with foreigners. Many foreigners come to Singapore not only for tourism but also for health care and so on. So you can imagine with one crisis, because in 2008, many hospitals in Singapore empty. Because what? The patient normally came from Indonesia, Malaysia, and others. But then when the crisis appeared, hospital empty, and then it was hit for Singapore economy. So what lesson can we learn? Next slide. Next. Yeah. First, try to maintain long-term high economic growth, especially for countries like China, India, Indonesia, with more than 100 million people. Maybe for Singapore it's not important, but for Indonesia, for India, for China, for some African countries with many people inhabited, so must keep long-term high economic growth. Supported by sound fiscal and monetary policy. This is very serious because many countries fail to have sound fiscal and monetary policy, especially fiscal. That's why many governments in Africa, also in South Asia, have high foreign debt, government foreign debt. Banking sector must remain in good health, this is for sure. And the balance sheets of the banking, corporate and household sector must keep strong. And price inflation must keep stable, below 1 digit, or within 1 digit. And next, external position must remain sound. Try to export more than import, and you must rely on export of primary commodity, change to manufacture, because especially in the past few years, prices of primary commodity like coal and many others in the world market decline, and I think it will continue to decline. So try to shift from primary commodity to manufacture and services. Import dependency, especially for consumer and industrial goods, should be minimized. Indonesia has problem until now. We must depend on anything. We import anything, that's a problem. But we are dealing now with the problem. And public finance must remain strong, and also both government and private sector should both the private sector should always be careful in financing. And finally, next final slide. And so also very important, we learned a lot from 1998 crisis. Government should always be ready for any types of crisis. So the government always does simulation for different scenarios, different crises. Now we have small crisis because of rupiah depreciate until now, and we also try to stimulate if Chinese economic growth now decline around 6%. China normally 10%. 6% is very big for us because we export to China. So we stimulate if the China continue to decline until 4%. Whoa, very dangerous, 4%. If China 4%, more danger for the world than Indonesia 4%, for instance. Or Singapore 4%, no problem. Even France 4%, no problem. But China 4%, very, very big problem. Because they, the eater in the world, they eat anything, primary goods, anything from us. And we depend on them. So please eat, so we sell. If you don't eat, you cannot sell, you don't have money. So we always pray, China, please 10% growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I guess it would be quite interesting to have a discussion between Mr. Desmond and Mr. Hamdan on all these issues. It's quite important to understand the Asian crisis, and particularly the 1998 Indonesian one, after the famous Golden Age. At one point you questioned whether Africa had experimented with such a deep crisis. Well, we did actually for almost 3 decades. The debt and the structural adjustment policies, everything was experimented on Africa through guinea pigs, I think. The initial the capital flow that you mentioned are very important, and the depreciation of the currency is still something very sensitive linked to the Asian crisis. I mean, for people who are not familiar with political economy, it's clear that depreciation of the national currency is part of the evaluation processes that the World Bank always advocates, and the balance between the two measure, and this probably fit with your institutional liberals, so your dialogue would be quite interesting. I found interesting that you raised informal sector linked to unemployment as a way out against poverty. But I think you also, with a lot of originality, raised the myth of the Asian tiger becoming a cat. And actually, maybe some people noticed, but there was this cat trying to enter the room. And obviously an Indonesian cat. And we should maybe go and ask him what Mr. Tambunan has said is referring to it. Anyway, so I think the measure you raised would probably please the World Bank, despite of the crisis aftermath. The banking sector, the consuming remained quite balanced and stable, and you propose to maintain high economic growth. This question, obviously, what externalities, the weight on the environment, is this good to have growth without proper redistribution? I mean, we have also to address those issues, because growth is not necessarily, in my reading, necessarily the good way, as long as we don't have a more holistic development. The solution that you are giving, increase exchange reserve, developing manufacturing goods based on international specialization, and the prospect of the Chinese decline for the whole world market in your region are the big area of concern. Now, quite linked to this topic, but now more linked to trade and investment relation between Zimbabwe and Asia, we have Miss Samantha Mtezo from Zimbabwe. She's a researcher, and so she has the floor, last but not least.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Teuku Samantha Mtezo, as mentioned by the Chair, and I am a student of International and European Law at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where I am based. And I'm not an expert at trade or investment, but I will try my best to elaborate more on the topic based on my own personal experiences and my own personal opinion, as well as the research that I've managed to make. I, for one, have represented over 30,000 students in the Netherlands at student unions, and this has really inspired me to want to represent minorities, females, people of color, Africa, Zimbabwe, and which is why I'm here today, and which is why I will talk to you a little bit about the relationship between Zimbabwe and Asia in terms of trade. And I would like to thank the former speaker for introducing the topic as well. There's no denying the link between state development and economics. This stands as the basis upon which emerging economies can maintain their independence and develop themselves whilst cooperating with each other in a manner that allows them to remain free from modern imperialism. These were the precepts upon which the Bandung spirit was created. The link between economics and aspirations of developing states has always been of peculiar and of grave concern to me. This is mainly based on my background and experience as an African female born and raised in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe went from being considered the breadbasket of Africa with a stable and strong economy to experiencing a record-breaking level of hyperinflation. The effect of this demise in economics is undeniable and has led to a negative effect impacting the people of Zimbabwe from all fronts. Although this case is also one that is greatly interlinked with the political situation, which has led to barriers of trade and investment relations with the West, it resulted to an increase in trade and investment between Zimbabwe and Asia. My aim following my short presentation is to stimulate a discussion and receive contributions as to whether the existing trade relations have improved, as well as whether they are based on the premise of equality and beneficial for all parties involved. And these are amongst the centrifugal elements that need to be assessed in order to think of a way forward, in order to continue the Bandung spirit and ensure that the goals are reached by all states in the coming future. I will start by giving a background on the situation in Zimbabwe. Upon independence, the government of the newly formed Zimbabwe came up with a developmental state model that was informed by the Riddle Commission. The thrust of the economic policy after independence was growth, with equity, and its focus was to make government the driving force of economic development whilst addressing the social and economic inequalities. The social markets model, whose emphasis was on mixed economy, led to rapid expansion on education, health, rural development, infrastructure development, as well as deliberate emphasis on building strong government institutions and reduction on poverty. The emphasis on government institutions created employment and strong educated middle classes, which in turn drove development and ultimately growth, with equity created a high rate of economic growth and social development. Economic growth in Zimbabwe surpassed the average for sub-Saharan Africa during this period. In July 1990, government introduced the Economic Structural Adjustment Program, ESAP, whose emphasis was on economic and trade liberalization, as well as reduction on government spending. ESAP created massive social and economic problems, such as unemployment, reduced access to social services like health and education. And the general trend in the 1990s is that the economy showed signs of weakening on account of low investment, an adverse internal environment, and cutback in production by manufacturing industries. These had to be addressed with alternative legislation policies, which included the Zimbabwe Program for Economic and Social Transformation, ZIMPREST, Land Reform Act and Indigenization and Economic Empowerment Policy to empower local people and address historical imbalances caused by colonial history. And in the background to the implementation of land reforms and indigenization, the Western government's response was to impose economic sanctions against Zimbabwe, leading to economic challenges that include hyperinflation, critical shortages of foreign currency, and also shortages of goods as a result of trade restrictions. The sanctions had a negative impact on the economy, which included deindustrialization, a flight of capital and skills, as well as a severe reduction in the GDP and deterioration in the socio-economic conditions of the population. The inflation rate increased substantially from 2000, reaching severe hyperinflation in 2007, before peaking at 530% at the end of 2008. Given this general background of the Zimbabwean economic situation, I will now highlight the aspect of trade and how, in my perspective, it is interlinked to the Bandung spirit. In the 1990s, 60% of the country's major trading partners were developed countries, such as Germany, the United States of America, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Japan. Besides, the proportion of trade with these aforementioned partners was reasonably shared. No country accounted for more than 50% alone. That led to the trade risk being spread. However, following the trade embargo and economic sanctions placed on the Zimbabwean government, they had to look for alternative trading partners. This resulted in the Look East policy. Although there's no policy document and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has never released any formal document outlining the contents of the policy, its basic thrust is clear in government pronouncements and international travel patterns of the Zimbabwean officials. The policy is based on cooperation with the Far East countries, aimed at expansion of bilateral and trade relations, and offers priorities to investors from Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, India, Russia, and Indonesia, amongst others, but has focused increasingly on China to the exclusion of other countries. China has become the biggest buyer of Zimbabwean tobacco, purchasing over 13,000 tons of tobacco between January and October 2007. From 2000 to 2012, there were approximately 128 Chinese official development finance projects identified in Zimbabwe through various media reports. These projects range from a loan to expand a hydroelectric dam in Zimbabwe, to deal with finance of Zimbabwe's local cotton production, constructions of roads, schools, hospitals, as well as the provision of agricultural machinery to Zimbabwean farmers. The Zimbabwean government also purchased large amounts of transport equipment and military hardware from China, with educational scholarships being provided to Zimbabwean students to study in China, thus allowing for a cultural exchange. The impact is undeniable, with National Airline Air Zimbabwe also increasing their recruitment of Chinese-speaking flight attendants and training of existing flight attendants in the Chinese language, since tourism was now a main source of income from China as well. All of which is good on the surface and shows a strong commitment by both sides to trade and establish an economically mutual beneficial relationship. However, there are some concerns about such a policy, which I will now highlight. There have been some criticism as to whether this is an improvement in terms of trade, as well as whether such a trade relation is based on the premise of equality, and thus beneficial for all parties, as was the aim of the Bandung spirit. Scholars have argued that such trade relations make it impossible for Zimbabwe to diversify its own economy, as it heavily relies on limited income from the sale of raw materials that are needed by China. This is arguably the case with several other African states such as Zambia, and current crises that are facing due to their dependence on copper exports. We also have accusations that Africa is used as a dumping ground for cheap goods by developing countries, with textile industries in countries such as Zimbabwe having to close down their own factories due to their inability to compete with the influx of cheaper imports from Asia and Asian-made products as a result of this Look East policy. Furthermore, there is question as to whether the agreements in trade are reciprocal, with some academics claiming that the retail trade has remained one-sided, as countries such as China and other Asian countries still make it difficult for Africans to establish African markets or businesses in their countries. There are also claims that investors take advantage of the political situations in developing countries and thus do not conduct trade and investments in good faith or in the spirit of the Bandung Conference. Ultimately, the situation is twofold. There's little reassurance for investors who wish to attribute towards development of most developing countries, given the harsh political environment, with business partners indicating that it is difficult to do business with their counterparts from Africa, including Japan, which requested insurance cover for political risk. In conclusion, I would like to leave you with some questions, which I hope to get some feedback on at the conference. The question is the premise on which trade relations and investment between African states and other developing countries mutually beneficial? Or rather, does this result in a dependence by Africa on emerging economies as opposed to Western states? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was quite refreshing and a good time. The question you raised is central. I think after the Bandung era and the political advances, the main thing is the issue of economy, and we have quite a good floor today, I think, to discuss. For those of you who are not familiar with Zimbabwe, the Lancaster House Agreement, actually willing buyer, willing seller, transformed this economy. It was a political victory, but on the economic side, a lot has to be done. The country has started something that was quite similar from the Bandung bourgeois era and ended up being indebted, and as she mentioned, the structural adjustment ESOP was quite harsh, increased the the problem generated also by the international sanctions. And now a new partner looking Far East strategy, and Zimbabwe is not the only one. China buying tobacco, as he said, but also helping in various technical cooperation. The question here, whether we are trapped in comparative advantage, this issue of international division of labor, specialization, I think you raised that also for Indonesia. The three strategies, unfortunately, from my point of view, are linked to something that haven't changed for the past 50 years. I think if you really want to be critical, and it's not just to contradict the people on the desk, but I think these strategies are the strategy that were advocated by the World Bank, by the IMF and the WTO. And I find quite interesting that we haven't learned from the first lesson from Asia, because the first lesson from Asia were a non-debted strategy based on self-reliance or sometimes with a room of maneuver of the state. And now we have this open market strategy, which I think we have today the ground to discuss. We have proponent people who seems to advocate this approach of more tiger, more growth, etc. Personally, as you know, and as I presented, I think we need to link to create an whole internal market of consumption, to develop more South-South cooperation. But from the floor and from my reading of the outcome that are possible, it's exactly the contrary. It's more integration, more liberal institutional system as it is advocated. So the floor is yours. I think they will have the chance to elaborate a little more on these strategies, but this is the dominant strategy. This is what is happening. And have we surrendered? I just came from China recently, and what I have seen there, basically, on this so-called socialist market strategies, what I have noticed is how market is slowly gaining momentum, and how socialism seems to be embedded in market. So this may sound scary for people who are defending mass demand. So I think the floor is yours. If you have questions, and if our four interesting paper could be developed and elaborated. Yes, I would take a row of 3 or 4, please. Yes, go ahead. Can you just introduce yourself, please? Easier. To who you are addressing the question.
Okay, thank you very much for the time. My name is Eka. First of all, I'm very happy to see many young ones feel like more. It was like exactly my points yesterday, so I'm very happy to apply them today. Actually, I'm an architect by training, so I'm not very much into political and economical things, but I was forced to enter the fields as I had to build up my case on the urbanism theory in the MIT right now. So please pardon my lack of knowledge or maturity of the question that I will probably ask, because it's pretty much a technical question, so I'll make it straightforward. First of all, it's for Mr. Adrian. I would propose a premise that say that, in my opinion, the 1955 Asian African Conference was more of a political call rather than an institutional call, which was really needed at the time because of the bipolar setting of the world order at that time. Although it also has the multilateral Bandung+60, which you cleverly suggest to the next period of time. Now the question is that is it really possible to create the liberalism institution that is not really based on the regionalism? Because in the sense that Asia and Africa itself, or even if we go further to tricontinental, it's not a region, because it's the whole half of the world. So how are you proposed to make a part of that large, very large area of geography. And then second is my question to Mr. Tulus. I would like to move on from Mr. Chairman's opinion, which is I find it really interesting too, because I think most of the time we always talk about this bulky macroeconomics indicators, which brings me to the two really questions between the GDP versus the GDP per capita, and the second is the GDP growth versus the GDP base platform. So in a sense, it really connects with some of the papers that were presented yesterday, which just to make it a bit quick, if I use the perspective of the Western world through the Bandung+60 paper, there were like minimum 3 papers that really explain about the BRICS phenomenon. The global economic paper number 134 with how solid the BRICS are. But the BRICS in this way with a little s, not a big s, conducting that the BRIC is only the BRIC without an s, which also represents only the Asian region without the South Africa. And then the second paper number 157 is the M11 more than acronym, which basically will tell you about the next 11 that follows. And the 188 paper, number 188, about the United Korea, and which they suggest as the BCK of the BRIC instead of the South Africa. But the point is that despite of this all GDP phenomena that they implies today, and even as Bandung+60 prophesied in the 2050, their prophesied GDP per capita is still so small in comparison to G7 when we have G8 minus Russia, because Russia we overthrew it to the BRIC area. So then the question is, what's the point? It's just like we're just running numbers, and it's like as the economic indicators is being capitalized by the media to make us feel happy. But because like the reason is that it's really like reminding me of the books, the progressive poverty, which we just see in the charts, but it has like nothing to do with the real life situation. That's all my question.
I'm Bahadur, representing College University of Delhi, teaching economics over here. Now my question relates to the last 2 papers, Mr. Jones and Ms. Khudori. In the lessons learned from the Indonesian crisis, one of the key lessons was that we should reduce the dependence on export of primary goods, and there should be increase in export of manufactured goods. Our Prime Minister Modi is also currently saying that he's inviting people to come and invest and make in India. He's trying to come. On the other hand, the paper on Zimbabwe. Now she pointed out things that the things which are manufactured in Zimbabwe, are there markets for those manufactured goods? Have we analyzed that? Are the world markets prepared to buy the manufactured goods which key countries are trying to sell and make in our own country? So one is that, is there any analysis of the market that we have done of the manufactured goods that we are trying to make in our country? Secondly, in the morning there was a talk by Professor Mohanty in which he commented upon the environmental effect that these things will have in terms of climate change and environmental problems. So my question is primarily to Professor Khudori regarding this. Is there a market analysis about the manufactured goods?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Ebrima. I'm from Indonesia. comment to the first two speakers, to Desmond. This is interesting effort, I think, to make this Bandung spirit work, something like that. But would you probably elaborate more? But I'm not really sure this liberal institutionalism, I'm not really sure how it will work and contribute to the new partnership, things like that. That's the clarification. And to Jitwami, Dr. Fahmi Jitwami, I'm not sure. But the question is, this is also interesting, but also clarification. We have this sovereignty problem, scientific problem, when we talk about humanitarian interventions. I'm not sure how you deal with this concept. So if you talk about global justice, then whether if we talk about global justice, then we should forget our sovereignty. So probably you can explain more about this. Thank you.
Can we take a second round of questions, please? All right, so would you like to start or?
Aziz, just one word, Aziz, that we should stop at 5:45. Yeah, okay? Perfect. Yeah.
I will keep short. First, GDP is easy indicator to answer the question, what do you have? We have GDP and GNP. We have GDP and GNP. GNP, what you earn, while GDP, what you have in your house. So that's why GDP is easy. But it doesn't mean that high GDP, it means everybody happy. Like you can ask what you earn from your work. I earn $10 million per month, but it doesn't make sure that your wife is happy. So GDP is just an aggregate indicator. But now there are already start to have alternative measures dealing with the environment and so on. But like now we have many indicators like happiness and so on. So that's to complement, not to compensate, but to complement GDP. And second question, if you keep depending on primary goods, you have two risks. First, unstable prices because of war, because of weather, because of political unrest like oil boycott in 1973, oil boycott in 1982 because of Israel-Palestina conflict. So we always have the risk of unstable price if we depend on primary goods. So we must reduce the dependency on primary goods. And also you lose your value added. Better you produce first in your country and then you export. That's why now in Indonesia we start with dollarization or downturn industrialization. Secondly, prices of primary goods tend to decline because of technical progress, synthesis, compound synthesis, and also more countries become more efficient in using raw material. So then the demand for this raw material decline and the price also decline. Like what happened now with palm oil and so on, because many demand decline. That's why if we have technology, I mean, you can buy technology. Why you don't just process your raw material first in your country, maybe semi-product or fully ended product, and then you export. That's my response.
Kind of is the question of Eka to Adrian about liberal institutional based on lacking regionalism.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I take this opportunity to absorb the feedback from the participants. Actually, the title of my paper is In Search of the Emancipatory Instrument for the South. So, I really thank you. I really appreciate this as a feedback for me. Well, I agree that the regionalism, which is not based on the geography matters, yes, Asia Pacific, taking one example, this cooperation, this regionalism cooperation is not anymore based on the regionalism per se. The participation of countries in Latin America, in North America, in Pacific, Oceania are welcome in the Asia Pacific. And we see that another example, the cooperation between Asia and Africa, we have already seen the Sino-African Progress Development for one example. And another example, we see Tokyo International Conference for African Development. And there is another here. This is Vietnam African Progress Development. So, these two examples, I can also say that my proposition is to promote the role of the Asian African Sub-Regional Organization Conference, who involved in the initiative process of establishment of the new Asian African Strategic Partnership in 2003 and 2004. It was discussed for the very first time in this building in June 2003 by 16 Asian African Sub-Regional Organization Conference. And then it was continued by the deep discussion in Durban, South Africa in 2004. And the result that would be discussed in Asian African Summit 2005, I propose that the role of the Asian African Sub-Regional Organization Conference should be strengthened, should be enhanced to promote the new liberalism, liberalism institutional of the NAASP. New African Union. During the Organization of African Union, initiated by Kwame Nkrumah, according to some historical facts, it is not succeeded in making instrumentation to stabilize, to make their own initiative, to find a reconciliation, to find a new way, solution for Africa. After the amendment of the Constitution of African Union in 1997, we can say the involvement of Gaddafi, and then finally declared in 2002, African Union has new era. African Union has their own liberalism institution. African Union could make their own instrument to complete their own internal affairs in Africa. They can manage all affairs by having their own instruments because of the liberalism institutionalism through the transformation of Organization of African Union to the African Union. So, if we can say that several Asian African Sub-Regional Organization Conference in Africa will be centered as a part supervised by the African Union, we see ASEAN, we have the ASEAN Way. Now ASEAN Way also is coming towards the new ASEAN Way. ASEAN, the old ASEAN Way is considered could not compete with the new challenges in the omnipolarism system. The new ASEAN Way will have the instrument that will be used by the ASEAN as the regionalism organization to strengthen several cooperation. So I can say that new Asian African strategic partnership without the effort to transform from the liberalism to liberalism institutional, and AASP will never have an instrument, will never have a binding legal to the members of the new Asian African Strategic Partnership. Well, this is just my proposition. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the last item.
Correct me if I'm wrong, your question was about whether we've established if there's a market?
Yes, that's what it was about.
Reduce dependency on
It was
imports.
primarily to him because one of the lessons learned was regarding reduction of exports of primary products and increased reliance of selling manufactured goods?
Okay, yeah. I think then one of the speakers already elaborated on that as one of the solutions, and my presentation was mostly intended to get solutions from the audience. Thank you.
Before I get to Professor Mohanty, you know, I have mixed feelings and I feel embarrassed. But as a chair, I don't want to interfere, but I just want to elaborate. One of the interesting things that the university in Helsinki, the UN Uniwider program, 2006, I think, if I believe, the household new calculation. Because political economy, whether you go for wealth or well-being, you have two different way of portraying. So the GDP doesn't portray, the per capita is not portraying the reality of. So they said, okay, why don't we calculate for the true meaning, what is the household level? What does it mean to be rich? Do you know how much it takes to be rich on this global planet? 2% of the planet, of the human beings who are rich, just 2%. But what it takes to belong to those 2%. And this thing is just unbelievable. If you own $2,200 without having any debt, whether it is in assets or any means, you belong to those 2%. Imagine, if you have 500,000, you belong to 37 million people. So these are the accurate figures on the floor, on a daily basis for everyone. So it means that in fact, 2% of the world income is to be shared by 50% of the world population. These are the true figures, and these are figures that are not lying. So when we have, and that's why I have an embarrassment, when we want to link sovereign policy of the Bandung spirit to strategies of neocolonial and imperialist World Bank strategy who are advocating for institutional liberalization to create wealth, I have doubts. I have doubts. I think it's a deep contradiction. And they failed after 60 years. So how come they're coming from the rear back door and proposing the strategy like NIPAD in the African clan, like the one that unfortunately Ebrima Sall left, explained about the new strategy of Africa, the new Pacific trade agreement that is in discussion, has been signed. So I have mixing. I look forward for you guys, even if it's in research. I think we have to be critical, because this is exactly what this Bandung place was trying to not take side, because it was siding with the imperialist world. So personally, I have mixed feelings. Not even mixed feelings. I have my clear position that we have to go on the opposite side, but obviously we are not in the mainstream. And this is today the Tina syndrome. There is no alternative but the institutional world. And Barack Obama would say, yes, Asia, Africa just needs strong institutions. So this is highly debatable, and I refer to the Mike Moore paper on not learning the lesson from Asia. It was an IDS paper in the 90s. Very interesting paper, if those of you. So, Professor Mohanty, sorry.
Really taken up the issues that I had in mind. And this is from the entire panel actually, but especially also, they guide us to what kind of NASP we need for promoting that kind of for example, you had suggested that big countries like us, India, China, Indonesia, have to have long-term high growth rate. Now, you are considering that the GDP-focused growth strategy has to be the basic premise, and you wish that China should not go down further, because then they will buy our raw materials, our primary commodities. Now, on the other hand, we would like a different kind of economy altogether. We would like an economy where agriculture, industry, services, and knowledge economy. They are not sequential, as we have been told that we have to be like now we have to be ultimately like the US, service economy and knowledge economy. Whereas the Bandung perspective, keeping in mind the achievements and the problems of the industrial revolution of the last 200 years, would suggest that we should integrate all those four. We should have agriculture, industry, service and knowledge economy simultaneously in such a way that they reinforce each other. And that is why we should not depend on selling commodities. We should just for increasing our income. And again, this preoccupation with manufacturing. The lesson from China is that just going mad about manufacturing for world market created some of the present problems of environmental destruction, inequalities and imbalance, urban-rural development, despite the successes. Therefore, I would suggest that the Bandung political economy would have different premises learned from last 200 years and the last 30 years. That's my first. Now, therefore, and you have already alluded to this, the liberal institutional. Would you like the EU to be the model and come to the crisis that they have not? Even EU. Whereas we would like the NASP to have a creative institutional framework which actually takes these economies in the direction of the Bandung political economy, an alternative development model, an alternative trade model which promotes that kind of political economy. Therefore, that will be my suggestion. And therefore, the humanitarian intervention again follows from that. Now, the EU in South Sudan, how would we say yes and no to that? That is the paradox. And therefore, your research, the Zimbabwe, China, or India and many African countries, China and many African countries, the new economic relations have to be critiqued from this viewpoint. And both Zimbabwe and China have to ask these questions to themselves. Are they creating new dependencies, or are they creating a mutually dependent and mutually helpful economic model?
Thank you. These are really key questions. We are 60 years later, so we are harvesting and we have to find new ways, and obviously it's very challenging. Unless you really have to comment, but I think as a concluding remark, we will use Professor Mohanty's statement as a way of wrapping up this session. So thanks a lot. We'll be here tomorrow. Warm applause to